Think kids can't be cruel? Think again. In 1547, a 9-year-old boy named Edward VI became King of England, and almost immediately the burnings began. He wasn't some helpless puppet. Behind his angelic face was a calculating religious fanatic who banned mercy, outlawed compassion, and used torture as political theater. He called it godliness. Historians call it terrifying. From public floggings to watching his own uncle executed, this wasn't childhood. It was tyranny in miniature. By the end of this video, you'll understand how absolute power turned a sweet-looking child into a cold, smiling executioner. Let's plunge into the twisted truth. Edward VI was just 9 years old when he inherited the English throne in 1547. Most kids at that age were learning manners, not how to sign death warrants. But Edward was different. Raised as the golden hope of the Protestant Reformation, he was trained to rule like a prophet with a crown. His tutors didn't teach him kindness. They taught him dogma. Imagine this: a child reading scripture about burning heretics, then watching it happen. Edward's coronation wasn't just a ceremony, it was a political weapon. Protestants paraded him as a holy symbol, a boy chosen by God to purify England. Behind him stood men like the Duke of Somerset, his uncle and Lord Protector, who held real power. But Edward wasn't a puppet for long. By age 11, he was already making policy notes in the Royal Journal, demanding harsher laws against Catholics, stricter morality codes, and punishment for dissenters. He wasn't writing childish stories. He was documenting sin. Modern psychologists might call it indoctrination, but in Tudor England, it was divine duty. A child became the mouthpiece of political vengeance, and England would bleed for it. And this was just the beginning, because Edward's first act of cruelty would target the man who raised him. Family meant nothing in Edward's England. Not even blood could buy mercy. The Duke of Somerset, Edward's uncle, had ruled England as regent during the boy's early reign. He wasn't a saint, but he tried to spare lives. He reduced heresy burnings, released some Catholic prisoners, and even hesitated to crush rebellions too harshly. To Edward, that was weakness. At just 14, Edward turned on the very man who'd raised him. Here's the twist. Somerset was arrested not for treason, but for being too lenient. His enemies, especially John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, saw an opportunity to use Edward's fanaticism against him. They whispered poison into the boy's ear. Your uncle is soft. Your uncle is unfit. Your uncle is a threat to God's justice. Edward agreed. He gave his silent consent. On January 20, 1552, the Duke of Somerset was beheaded on Tower Hill. Witnesses said the young king showed no emotion, no sadness, no hesitation, just quiet approval. This was the boy's first kill. And he didn't stop there. In modern terms, imagine a teenager who believes anyone who disagrees with him should die, and has the state's full power to make it happen. That was Edward VI, and the executions were just getting started. Under Edward VI, mercy didn't just disappear, it was outlawed. By 1551, Edward's government passed laws that made it a crime to even suggest clemency for heretics. That's right, if you begged for someone's life, you could be charged with sedition. Why? Because mercy was seen as rebellion against God's will. And Edward believed he was God's will on earth. Public burnings increased. So did floggings, brandings, and public humiliation rituals, all justified as purifying the soul. One man was whipped through the streets simply for possessing a Catholic rosary. Another had his tongue cut out for suggesting priests should be allowed to marry. And Edward? He didn't blink. He believed suffering cleansed the wicked. He once wrote in his journal that heretics deserved flames to save their souls. That's a 14-year-old boy advocating state-sponsored torture because he thought it was holy. Imagine a middle schooler with control over a nation's morality police. Now imagine he thinks your beliefs are sinful. That's the nightmare England lived under. And Edward didn't just enforce cruelty. He re-engineered it. His next move turned punishment into a public entertainment spectacle. Under Edward, punishment wasn't just about pain. It was about public shame. Think stocks and pillories were bad? Edward took it further. In 1550, his council introduced a new penalty, the sinner's parade. Convicted offenders were stripped, painted in ashes, and marched through the streets with signs describing their sins. Wife of a papist, blasphemer, whore of Babylon. Crowds were encouraged to jeer, spit, and throw filth. The worst part? Children were forced to watch. In fact, school teachers were required by royal order to bring their students to executions and parades to teach them godly justice. Edward called this moral instruction. It didn't matter how small the crime. One 70-year-old woman was flogged in the town square for not attending Protestant services. Her screams echoed across the stone streets, while townsfolk were told to give thanks for justice. And Edward watched it all from his gilded palace, convinced he was saving England's soul. The cruelty wasn't accidental. It was engineered to be instructional. Like reality TV, except the punishment was real, the blood was real, and the audience was legally required to cheer. But what about his own household? Surely his family was safe from his wrath, right? You'd think Edward would protect his sisters. Think again. Mary Tudor, later known as Bloody Mary, was Edward's older half-sister and a devout Catholic. She refused to convert, refused to attend Protestant Mass, and worst of all, refused to be silent. That enraged Edward. He declared her a traitor to God and demanded she be punished. His council hesitated. Arresting a princess? Risky. But Edward pushed harder. According to ambassador reports from 1551, the young king screamed at his advisors, calling them cowards for refusing to imprison Mary. He called her blinded by papist filth and unworthy of royal blood. Here's the twist. The only thing that stopped her arrest was Spain. Mary was the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, Spain's beloved queen. Any harm to Mary risked war with Emperor Charles V. Only international politics saved her. Edward was furious. In his journal he wrote, "The Lady Mary persists in damnable superstition, and her heresy must be rooted out." This was no childish tantrum. This was religious hatred backed by power. Today we'd call it familial abuse. In Tudor England, it was divine justice. But Edward's fury didn't stop at family. His next targets were the poor, and they would suffer in ways you won't believe. Edward VI didn't just target heretics and his own family. He went after the poor. In 1547, his government passed the Vagrancy Act, one of the most brutal laws in English history. If you were homeless and unemployed for more than 3 days, you could be branded with a red-hot iron right on the chest, with the letter V for vagabond. That's right. A 9-year-old king made poverty a crime punishable by branding. But it got worse. Branded vagabonds could be sold into slavery for 2 years to anyone who found them. If they tried to escape, a lifetime of slavery. If they ran again, death. Edward claimed this would encourage industry. In reality, it created a new class of state-owned slaves, mostly poor men and women trying to survive during economic collapse. Imagine punishing joblessness with forced labor. Imagine a world where helping a homeless person meant breaking the law. That was Edward's England. Even his own council eventually recoiled. The law was so vicious, so unworkable, that it had to be repealed in 1550. But by then, hundreds had already suffered mutilation, slavery, and public disgrace. This wasn't reform. It was cruelty disguised as order. And Edward, still barely a teenager, saw it as holy righteousness. But next came his most disturbing obsession: fire. Most monarchs avoided public executions. Not Edward. He requested detailed reports on every heretic burning. Sometimes he watched from a distance. Other times, he demanded eyewitness accounts of how the flames behaved, how long it took, what screams were heard. In 1550, a Protestant radical named Joan Bocher, ironically from Edward's own faith, was sentenced to burn for blasphemy. She claimed Christ didn't assume human flesh like others. A theological dispute, yes, but worth dying for? Edward thought so. When some counselors hesitated, Edward reportedly insisted, "She would never recant. She is infected with poison." Archbishop Cranmer begged him to show mercy. Edward refused. She was burned alive. Witnesses described the fire consuming her slowly, her prayers turning into shrieks. Edward read the execution report like scripture. Why the obsession? Because to Edward, fire wasn't just punishment. It was purification. He believed heretics were fuel for God's justice. In modern terms, we'd call this sociopathic detachment, a child treating human pain as divine arithmetic. It wasn't the only time. Catholics, Anabaptists, dissenting Protestants, anyone outside Edward's dogma was fuel for the flame. Under his rule, execution wasn't a last resort. It was policy. But Edward wasn't just purging faith. He was erasing an entire culture. Edward didn't just oppose Catholicism. He tried to wipe it from England's memory. Under his reign, churches were stripped bare, altars smashed, statues beheaded, ancient wall paintings whitewashed, gold chalices melted, choir books burned. In some towns, mobs armed with hammers, blessed by royal warrant, marched through cathedrals like wrecking crews. Even the bones of saints were dug up and tossed in ditches. One chronicler from 1550 wrote, "The dust of holiness was swept into the street like common filth." This was a holy purge. Edward's new Book of Common Prayer replaced centuries of ritual. Mass in Latin? Gone. Prayers to the Virgin Mary? Banned. Priests who resisted were jailed, or worse, it wasn't just about faith. It was cultural annihilation. Imagine demolishing every temple, shrine, or mosque in a country overnight, and rewriting history to pretend they never existed. That's what Edward did to medieval Catholic England. He was England's first religious iconoclast, and he did it before turning 15. To him, it was necessary. To historians, it was cultural vandalism on a royal scale. But even this campaign wasn't as chilling as what he planned for England's future. A plan built on one final, grotesque power play. Edward's reign was short, but he intended to make its legacy eternal. By early 1553, the teenage king was dying. Tuberculosis had eaten away his lungs. He coughed blood, couldn't eat, could barely walk. But his mind? Still obsessed with power. His greatest fear? That his Catholic sister Mary would undo everything. So, as he lay dying, Edward did the unthinkable. He rewrote the line of succession. He declared Mary and Elizabeth illegitimate. Instead, he named his cousin, Lady Jane Grey, a 16-year-old Protestant noblewoman, as heir to the throne. Why? Because she was Protestant, and more importantly, controllable. Edward's decision triggered one of the most tragic coups in English history. Jane ruled for just 9 days before Mary's supporters stormed London. Jane was imprisoned, later beheaded, all because a dying boy king couldn't let go of control. His final act wasn't peace, it was sabotage. Edward didn't just want to rule in life. He wanted to rule from the grave. But fate had other plans. His death would be slow, painful, and filled with the kind of poetic justice Tudor history seems to specialize in. Edward VI died on July 6, 1553. He was just 15, but this wasn't a peaceful passing. Witnesses described him gasping for breath, choking on his own blood, blistered and raving with fever. His fingernails turned black, his skin cracked and oozed. He cried out for water, for help, but none came. Some said it was divine punishment. Others whispered poison. But the real horror? How quickly he was forgotten. Less than 2 weeks later, Mary I claimed the throne and reversed nearly everything he'd done. Catholic Mass returned. Protestant leaders were executed. The nation mourned Edward briefly, and then buried his legacy. Even his funeral was muted. No great mourning, no national ceremony. Just a small procession of clergy, barely noted by the public. The boy king who ruled like a tyrant, who branded beggars, burned heretics, and rewrote the crown, was now a footnote. He died as he lived, convinced he was saving England while tearing it apart. But his ghost would haunt the nation in unexpected ways, because what came next was even bloodier. Edward's death didn't bring peace. It lit the fuse for religious civil war. Mary the Mazana, his Catholic sister, became queen and launched her own reign of terror. She burned Protestants in the hundreds. Whole villages watched their pastors scream in fire, and the irony? She used Edward's own laws to do it. That's right. The statutes Edward passed, banning mercy, legalizing execution for heresy, became the very tools Mary wielded to massacre his followers. Edward built the pyres. Mary lit them. This is the twisted legacy of child monarchs wielding adult power. Edward believed he was building a godly kingdom, but in reality, he created a machine of persecution that didn't care who pulled the lever. The bodies piled up, the churchyards filled, and the English people began to realize tyranny wears many crowns. Whether boy or woman, child or queen, when faith becomes law, blood follows. And Edward VI, England's youngest king, had written that script. History tends to romanticize young kings. But Edward VI wasn't a child hero. He was a child tyrant. He killed his uncle, tried to imprison his sister, burned people alive for thought crimes, criminalized the poor, and left England in ruins. All before the age of 16. Was he a monster? Or just a boy twisted by power? Maybe both. Because the truth is, Edward wasn't born cruel. He was made cruel by propaganda, religion, and a court that worshipped control more than compassion. He smiled as England bled, and when he died, the fires he started kept burning. So, what do we make of him? Edward VI, the angel-faced child who branded beggars, burned heretics, humiliated his own citizens, and rewrote the monarchy with a quill gripped by trembling, tubercular fingers. He wasn't a villain in the traditional sense. He didn't command armies or slaughter on the battlefield. He didn't lust after power with wild, adult abandon like his father, Henry VIII. No, Edward's violence was colder, more righteous, more terrifying. He believed he was saving the world, and that's what makes him so disturbing. Because behind the royal robes and the glittering crown was a child. A boy fed doctrine instead of empathy, scripture instead of stories, fire instead of love. He was taught to see the world in absolutes, good versus evil, Protestant versus Papist, purity versus sin, and he applied those lessons like a surgeon with a rusty blade, cutting through England's soul and calling it Reformation. From the moment he inherited the throne at 9 years old, Edward was weaponized by powerful men who knew exactly what they were doing. They shaped his thoughts, curated his education, praised his cruelty. And when he finally began to wield power himself, he mimicked what he had seen. No compromise, no mercy, just divine punishment, carried out in his name. This wasn't governance. It was religious absolutism dressed as kingship. Let's not forget what we've seen. A child king who ordered his own uncle's death, not for treason, but for kindness. A teenager who designed public humiliation rituals to make crowds cheer as the poor and elderly were flogged in the street. A monarch who watched burnings like they were school plays, who read execution reports with fascination, who banned mercy from the legal system entirely. A boy who nearly imprisoned his sister just for praying the wrong way, and would have succeeded if not for the threat of Spanish war. A king who rewrote the line of succession on his deathbed, not for the good of the realm, but to preserve his version of religious purity at the cost of lives and legacies. And in the end, he died alone, gasping, forgotten. It's tempting to look at Edward and say, that's history, that's the past. We've evolved. But have we? Today, we still elevate young celebrities and influencers and politicians far beyond their emotional capacity. We still mistake charisma for wisdom, certainty for truth, and power for virtue. We still live in a world where ideology can justify cruelty, where children are molded to hate, and entire systems profit from their blind belief. Edward's story isn't just about Tudor England. It's about what happens when innocence is fed into the meat grinder of ideology and comes out wearing a crown. What's worse than a tyrant? A child who believes he's holy and has the full power of the state behind him. So ask yourself, what modern laws are we passing today that future generations will find monstrous? What dogmas are we teaching, not as choices, but as absolute truths? What young minds are being shaped, not with compassion, but with command? Edward VI didn't rule for decades. He didn't need to. He proved that it only takes a few years, sometimes just a few decisions, to scar a nation for generations. He was the most dangerous child in English history. And now, his story is yours to remember.